The moving truck coughed and sputtered as it climbed the final hill, its engine protesting against the steep incline and the weight of everything Sarah Mitchell owned. Behind the wheel, Sarah gripped tightly, her knuckles white against the worn leather, while her 13-year-old daughter Emma pressed her face against the passenger window, watching the dense forest roll past like a living, breathing entity. "Mum, are you sure about this?" Emma asked, for what felt like the 100th time that week. The question had become a refrain, a melody of doubt that had accompanied them on the 12-hour drive from the city. Sarah glanced at her daughter, noting the mixture of concern and barely concealed excitement in Emma's green eyes that reminded her so much of the girl's father, though she tried not to think about him these days. "I'm sure, sweetheart, this is our fresh start, our adventure." The cabin finally came into view as they rounded the last bend, and Sarah's heart sank while Emma gasped audibly. The real estate photos had been generous, criminally generous, in fact. What stood before them was less a cabin and more a structure that seemed to be locked in an eternal battle with nature, and nature was winning decisively. The roof sagged in the middle like a swayback horse, missing shingles creating a patchwork pattern that would certainly spell disaster come the first rain. The porch tilted at an alarming angle, its wooden boards grey with age and neglect, some missing entirely, to reveal the dark space beneath. Windows were either cracked or so dirty that they reflected nothing but murky shadows. Vines had claimed the entire eastern wall, their tendrils snaking through gaps in the siding with proprietary determination. Sarah killed the engine, and in the sudden silence they could hear the forest, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of a bird, the creek that gave the property its name, gurgling somewhere beyond the tree line. "It's rustic," Emma offered diplomatically, though Sarah caught the tremor of uncertainty in her voice. "It's a disaster," Sarah replied with a laugh that bordered on hysterical. "But it's our disaster. And, sweetheart, it was all we could afford." The truth of that statement hung heavy between them. After the divorce, after the debts that weren't hers, but became hers anyway, after losing the house and watching her savings evaporate like morning dew, this ruined cabin in the middle of nowhere had represented the only opportunity for a fresh start. It had cost less than a used car, which should have been her first warning sign. They climbed out of the truck, and Emma immediately began exploring, her natural curiosity overcoming her initial skepticism. She was at that wonderful age, Sarah thought, where she was equal parts child and young woman, still capable of seeing magic in the world despite the hardships they'd faced. "There's a barn," Emma called out, pointing to a structure about 50 yards from the main cabin, hidden partially by overgrown brush. Or, well, something that used to be a barn. Sarah approached the cabin's front door, which hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. The lockbox the realtor had mentioned was still there, and inside, the key felt heavy and old in her palm, as if it carried the weight of all the years this place had stood empty. The door opened with a horror movie creak, and they stepped inside to musty air and the smell of decades of abandonment. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that penetrated the grimy windows. The interior was open concept by default. The main room served as kitchen, living area and dining space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 doors led to what Sarah assumed were bedrooms, and another to a bathroom. She wasn't sure she wanted to investigate just yet. But despite the grime, despite the obvious neglect, despite the way the floorboards groaned under their weight, Sarah felt something unexpected: hope. The bones of the place were good. The walls were solid log construction, the fireplace was magnificent stonework, and the ceiling, despite its sag, showed craftsmanship in its exposed beam construction. "We can do this," she said, more to herself than to Emma. "We can make this work." Emma had already moved to one of the bedroom doors, pushing it open to reveal a small space with a single window overlooking the woods. "This one's mine," she announced with the finality that only a teenager could muster. They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading the truck, carrying in the modest collection of furniture and boxes that represented their scaled-down life. Sarah had sold or donated most of their belongings, keeping only what was essential or irreplaceable. Each box was labeled in Emma's neat handwriting: books, kitchen, Mom's clothes, Emma's clothes, photos and memories. That last box Sarah placed carefully in what would be her bedroom, unable to look at it for too long. Inside were the remnants of the life she'd built and lost. Wedding photos she couldn't bring herself to destroy, Emma's baby pictures, report cards, art projects, the accumulated evidence of a family that no longer existed in its original form. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold, they sat on the dubious porch with sandwiches from the small-town diner they'd passed 15 miles back. The nearest town, Willow Creek, was small enough that the diner, a gas station and a general store constituted its entire commercial district. "Tell me about the people who lived here before," Emma said, biting into her sandwich. She'd always been fascinated by stories, by the lives that came before, by the idea that every place held echoes of those who'd inhabited it. Sarah pulled out the sparse paperwork the realtor had provided. Not much to tell, really. The cabin was built in 1952 by a man named Thomas Whitmore. He lived here until... Actually, the record isn't clear. It's been abandoned for at least 30 years, maybe longer. No heirs claimed it, so it eventually went to the county for unpaid taxes. "That's sad," Emma said quietly. "Imagine building a home and having no one to leave it to. Or maybe he wanted it to find someone who needed it," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the sentiment. "Maybe he wanted it to be a fresh start for someone like us." As darkness fell, they realized with dismay that there was no electricity connected yet. That wouldn't happen until the utility company came out later in the week, and the water pump needed to be primed. They'd known this intellectually, but the reality of it was different from the abstract concept. They made do with flashlights and the bottles of water they'd brought and bedded down in sleeping bags on top of their mattresses, too tired to properly set up the bed frames. Sarah lay awake long after Emma's breathing had evened out into sleep, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. There were no car horns here, no sirens, no sounds of neighbors through thin apartment walls. Instead, there was the rustle of leaves, the call of night birds, the creak of the old cabin settling, and underneath it all, a profound silence that was somehow louder than any city noise had ever been. What had she done? She'd taken her daughter to the middle of nowhere, to a ruin that would take every penny and every ounce of energy she had to make habitable. She had no job lined up, only the hope that she could freelance her graphic design work remotely and the small cushion of her remaining savings. The nearest school was a 20-minute drive, and that was if the truck kept running. But as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah forced herself to remember why they'd come. In the city, in their small apartment, they'd been drowning, in debt, in memories, in the ghost of the life they'd lost. Here, at least, they had space to breathe. They had possibility. They had a chance to build something that was truly theirs. The next morning arrived with birdsong and shafts of sunlight so pure and golden that Sarah forgave the cabin some of its shortcomings. Emma was already up, exploring the property with the fearlessness of youth, and Sarah decided to tackle the kitchen, which appeared to be where several decades of grime had decided to hold their annual convention. She was elbow-deep in cleaning out cabinets filled with mouse droppings and ancient, petrified food remnants when Emma burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and streaked with dirt. Mom, you have to see what I found." Sarah straightened, her back protesting the unfamiliar physical labor. "What is it? Please tell me it's not another animal skeleton. I can't handle another one of those today." "Better!" Emma grabbed her mother's hand, pulling her toward the door. "So much better!" They crossed the overgrown yard to the barn-like structure Emma had spotted the day before. Up close, it was in even worse shape than the main cabin, if that was possible. The large sliding door hung from a single rusted rail, and gaps in the siding offered glimpses of the dark interior. Emma pulled the door open far enough for them to slip through, and Sarah followed, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The barn was mostly empty, filled with that particular quality of silence that comes from long abandonment. But Emma led her to the back corner, where a pile of old tarps covered something large and angular. "I was just exploring," Emma explained, her words tumbling over each other in excitement. "And I saw this, and I thought maybe it was old farm equipment or something. But Mom, look." Together, they pulled back the tarps, releasing a cloud of dust that made them both cough. But as the dust settled and light filtered through the gaps in the barn walls, Sarah saw what had excited her daughter so much. It was a workbench, massive and solid, made of oak so old it had darkened to nearly black. But that wasn't what made Sarah's breath catch. The workbench was covered, absolutely covered, with tools. Hand tools of every description, each one hanging in its proper place, or laid out with meticulous care. Saws, planes, chisels, hammers, levels, squares, and dozens of implements Sarah couldn't even name. They were old, some rusted, but clearly quality pieces that had been maintained with care before being abandoned to time. "There's more," Emma said, moving to a series of wooden crates stacked against the wall. She'd already opened one, and inside, nestled in straw, were glass jars filled with nails, screws, and hardware, sorted by size and type with obsessive precision. Sarah ran her hand over the workbench, feeling the smoothness of wood worn by decades of use, the grooves and marks that told the story of countless projects completed in this space. This had been someone's sanctuary, their creative outlet, their pride. "This must have been Thomas Whitmore's workshop," Sarah said softly, "the man who built the cabin." "Do you think we can use them?" Emma asked. "I mean, to fix up the cabin. That's what they're for, right?" Sarah examined a handsaw, its blade still sharp despite the years. I think maybe that's exactly what we're supposed to do with them. It's like he left us a gift." They spent the rest of the morning cataloguing the workshop's contents, growing more amazed by the minute. There were plans and drawings, carefully rolled and stored in a cabinet, showing the original design of the cabin and various additions that had never been built. There were notebooks filled with meticulous notes about different types of wood, joinery techniques, and finishing methods. There was even a small library of woodworking books, their pages yellowed but still readable. "He must have loved this," Emma said, carefully turning the pages of one of the notebooks. "Look how neat his handwriting is. He cared about getting everything just right." Sarah nodded, feeling an unexpected connection to a man she'd never met, who died decades before. He'd poured his heart into this place, into his craft, and then somehow it had all been abandoned. What had happened? Where had he gone? Why hadn't anyone claimed this workshop, these tools, the cabin itself? As they walked back to the main house for lunch, Emma suddenly stopped, her expression thoughtful. "Mom, don't you think it's weird?" "What, sweetheart?" "All of this. The workshop left exactly as it was, like he just walked away mid-project. The cabin left standing but empty, no family to claim it. Doesn't it seem like there's a story there, like maybe something happened?" Sarah felt a small chill, despite the warm afternoon sun. "People's lives are complicated, Em. Maybe he had to leave suddenly, or maybe there are secrets," Emma interrupted, her eyes lighting up with that particular gleam that Sarah had come to associate with her daughter's stubborn determination. "Maybe there's more to discover. This could be like those mysteries I read about." "This isn't a book, honey. This is just an old cabin." But even as she said it, Sarah wasn't entirely sure she believed it. There was something about this place, something that whispered of stories untold and lives interrupted. And as they entered the cabin, both of them looked at it with new eyes, wondering what other secrets might be hidden in its shadows, waiting for the right people to discover them. Neither of them noticed the loose floorboard near Emma's bedroom door, the one that creaked differently than the others, the one that held secrets that would change everything they thought they knew about fresh starts and hidden treasures. 3 weeks into their new life, the cabin was slowly transforming from uninhabitable to merely challenging. Sarah had tackled the roof with a determination born of necessity, watching YouTube tutorials on her phone while perched precariously on a ladder that had seen better days. The water pump now worked most of the time, and the electricity had been connected, though the wiring was so old that they had to be careful not to overload circuits by running too many things at once. Emma had thrown herself into the project with surprising enthusiasm, perhaps eager for distraction from the upheaval in her life, or maybe just genuinely excited by the adventure of it all. She'd claimed the workshop as her special project, spending hours cleaning and organizing the tools, treating each one with a reverence that made Sarah's heart swell. School had started, and Emma rode the bus from the end of their long driveway each morning, returning in the afternoon with stories about her new classmates that she tried to make sound more positive than they probably were. Sarah knew the transition was hard, being the new kid always was, especially in a small town where everyone had known everyone else since kindergarten. Sarah herself had managed to secure a few freelance design contracts, working late into the night at the kitchen table. She'd refinished using techniques gleaned from Thomas Whitmore's notebooks. The work was sporadic, but it was something, and she supplemented it by taking on small jobs in town, cleaning the church, helping at the general store. Anything that brought in a little extra money without requiring her to be too far from home. It was a Saturday morning when everything changed. Emma had been in her room, finally unpacking the last of her boxes, when Sarah heard the crash, followed by a very uncharacteristic curse from her usually mild-mannered daughter. "Emma, you okay?" Sarah called, abandoning the sink she'd been scrubbing. "I'm fine. Can you come here? I think I found something." Sarah entered Emma's room to find her daughter on her knees near the doorway, a heavy box of books toppled beside her. She'd apparently been moving it when one corner had caught on a loose floorboard, pulling it partially up. "I was trying to rearrange, and the box got caught," Emma explained. "But Mom, look, this board is completely loose. Like not just old house loose, it's been deliberately cut." Sarah knelt beside her, examining the board in question. Emma was right. While the other floorboards were nailed securely, this one had been cut to fit precisely between the joists, creating a section that could be lifted out. The wood was slightly different too, newer than the surrounding floor, though still old by any reasonable standard. "Someone made a hiding place," Emma whispered, her voice filled with excitement. "Mom, we have to look." Sarah hesitated. Every reasonable fiber of her being said they should probably leave well enough alone, but curiosity, and perhaps the same sense of adventure that had led her to buy this place in the first place, won out. "Okay," she agreed, "but carefully. Who knows what might be under there?" Together, they worked the board loose, revealing a dark space beneath. Sarah grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight, and directed it into the opening. There, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a wooden box. Emma reached for it, but Sarah caught her hand. "Wait. Let me." The box was about the size of a shoebox, but heavier, made of the same dark oak as the workshop bench. Sarah lifted it out carefully, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that she couldn't quite explain. They carried it to Emma's bed, sitting side by side as Sarah carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. The box itself was beautiful, with dovetail joints that spoke of skilled craftsmanship, and a small brass latch that opened smoothly despite the years. Inside, nestled in velvet that had faded from deep blue to a dusty grey, were the fragments of a life. On top was a letter, the paper yellowed, but the ink still clear, written in the same neat handwriting they'd seen in the workshop notebooks. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And this old cabin has found new life with new people. That gives me more comfort than you might imagine. A house should be lived in, loved in, filled with the sound of voices and laughter. It's been too quiet here for too long. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I built this cabin with my own hands in 1952, when I returned from the war with dreams of a simple life in the woods. I was going to marry my sweetheart, Margaret, and we were going to fill this place with children and joy. Life, as it often does, had other plans. What you'll find in this box is the story I never got to tell, the life that almost was, and perhaps, if I'm not being too presumptuous, a treasure that might help you build the life I couldn't. Use it wisely, use it well. Use it to create the happiness that eluded me. Yours, across the years, Thomas Whitmore. October 1983. Emma's eyes were wide. "Mum, this is like something out of a movie." Sarah carefully set the letter aside, her hands trembling slightly. The next item was a photograph, black and white, showing a young man in military uniform standing beside a beautiful woman with dark hair and bright eyes. They were looking at each other rather than the camera, and even across the decades, the love between them was palpable. "That must be Thomas and Margaret," Emma said softly. Beneath the photo was a small leather journal, its pages filled with entries dating from 1945 to 1953. Sarah opened it randomly and read aloud, "June 15th, 1952. The cabin is finished. Every log placed with Margaret in mind, every window positioned to catch the light she loved, every corner crafted to hold the life we planned. Tomorrow I go to town to bring her here, to finally show her the home I've built for us. Tomorrow our life together truly begins." June 16th, 1952. "She's gone. Tuberculosis," they said. "She'd been sick for weeks but hid it from me, not wanting to worry me while I worked on the cabin. I brought flowers to a funeral instead of to my bride. The cabin sits empty, a monument to dreams that died." Sarah's voice broke, and Emma gently took the journal from her hands, continuing to read silently, tears streaming down her face. They spent the next hour going through the rest of the box's contents. More photographs showing Thomas and Margaret at various stages of their courtship. Letters Margaret had written during the war when Thomas was overseas, a pressed flower from their first date, a sketch Margaret had made of what she hoped their cabin would look like, remarkably similar to what Thomas had actually built. Near the bottom, wrapped in another piece of cloth, was a small wooden box. Emma opened it to reveal a stunning engagement ring, a simple gold band with a modest but beautiful diamond. Beside it was a man's wedding ring that had clearly never been worn. "He never married," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. "He built this whole life for her, and then he lived here alone, surrounded by reminders of what he'd lost." But it was the last item that made both of them gasp. At the very bottom of the box, in a separate sealed envelope, was a deed, not to the cabin, which Sarah already owned, but to a parcel of land. According to the document, Thomas Whitmore had owned not just the 5 acres the cabin sat on, but an additional 50 acres extending into the forest. And more importantly, according to a letter folded with the deed, that land contained something valuable. The letter was dated 1978. "I've been approached by a mining company interested in the copper deposits on my eastern boundary. They've offered a substantial sum, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my days. I've declined. Some things are worth more than money, the peace of these woods, the memories held in this land, the birds and deer and all the wild things that make their home here. But I'm not a young man anymore. My health is failing, and I have no children to leave this to, no family who would understand why this place matters. If someone finds this cabin, finds this letter, perhaps they'll see what I saw. A place of profound beauty worth protecting, but also worth something if protecting it means securing a future for someone who needs it. The mining company's contact information is included. The offer may still stand, or there may be others interested. But whoever you are, consider carefully. Money spent is just money gone, but land endures. Sarah and Emma stared at each other, the magnitude of what they'd found slowly sinking in. "Mom," Emma said carefully, "does this mean what I think it means?" Sarah looked at the deed, at the letter, at the contact information for Cascade Mining Corporation that was paperclipped to the back. I think we need to find out if we actually own this land. The deed I got when I bought the cabin only mentioned 5 acres. But if Thomas owned 50 acres, and there were never any other heirs, we could be sitting on a fortune, Emma finished, her voice awed. But Sarah was looking at the photographs, at the young couple who'd loved each other so fiercely and lost so much. Or we could be sitting on something more important. Did you see what he wrote about protecting this place? Emma picked up the engagement ring, holding it up to the light where the diamond caught the afternoon sun streaming through the window. He loved her so much, and he never got over losing her. He lived here for 30 more years, alone, surrounded by the life they'd planned together. "That's the real treasure in this box," Sarah said quietly. "Not the land or the mining rights. The real treasure is this reminder that love matters, that dreams matter, that the choices we make echo through time." They sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of the story they'd uncovered. Finally, Emma spoke. "But Mom, we need the money, don't we? I mean, we can barely keep up with repairs on the cabin, and I know you're stressed about making the bills every month even though you try to hide it. If this land really is valuable—" Sarah put her arm around her daughter, pulling her close. "We'll figure it out. First, we need to establish whether we actually have any claim to this land. Then we'll decide what to do. Together. Okay?" "Okay," Emma agreed. Then, hesitantly, "Can I keep the journal? I'd like to read all of it to really understand his story." "Of course," Sarah said, handing it over. "I think he'd like that someone finally heard it." That evening, after a dinner neither of them had much appetite for, they sat on the porch, now properly repaired and no longer life-threatening, watching the sun set over the forest. The woods stretched out before them, dense and green and mysterious, hiding secrets they'd never imagined. "What do you think happened to him?" Emma asked. "Thomas, I mean. How did he die? When? Why did no one ever claim the cabin or the land?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But maybe we can find out. There might be records in town, people who remember him. This is a small community. Someone must have known him." Emma nodded, her mind clearly working through possibilities. "Mum, do you think we're supposed to find all this? Like, maybe it's not just coincidence that we're here, that I happened to knock over that box in exactly the right spot to find the loose floorboard?" Sarah smiled at her daughter's romantic notion, but she couldn't entirely dismiss it either. There had been so many coincidences. Finding this property in the first place, being able to afford it, discovering the workshop, now this hidden treasure. It did feel like something more than mere chance. "Maybe," she said softly, "or maybe Thomas built this place so well, filled it with so much care and intention, that it naturally attracts people who need it, people like us." They sat together as the stars began to appear, and for the first time since the divorce, since the move, since all the upheaval and uncertainty, Sarah felt something that might have been peace. Yes, they had challenges ahead. Yes, there were questions to answer and decisions to make. But they also had each other, and now they had a story that connected them to this place in a way she'd never expected. In Emma's room, The wooden box sat on her dresser, its contents carefully arranged. The journal lay open to a page dated July 4th, 1952. I've decided to stay. Others have suggested I sell, move on, start fresh somewhere else. But this cabin holds Margaret's dreams as much as mine. To abandon it would be to abandon her all over again, so I'll stay. I'll live the life we planned as best I can, alone. And maybe, someday, someone else will find happiness in these walls, will succeed where we failed. That's a hope worth living for. The words seem to glow in the lamplight, a message from the past, reaching forward to touch the present, connecting three souls across the vast divide of time. A man who built with love, a woman who died too young, and a new family learning to build their own dreams on the foundation of someone else's heartbreak. But what none of them knew yet, not Thomas when he wrote those words, not Sarah and Emma as they sat watching the stars, was that the story was far from over. The box held more secrets than they'd yet discovered, the land held more value than any mining company could offer, and the small town of Willow Creek held memories of Thomas Whitmore that would shatter everything they thought they knew about the man and his tragic love story. The truth, as they would soon discover, was both more complicated and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. The Monday after their discovery, Sarah left Emma at the bus stop and drove straight to the Willow Creek County Courthouse, a small brick building that also housed the town library and historical society. If anyone could help her untangle the legal status of the land Thomas had claimed to own, it would be here. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes, listened to Sarah's story with growing interest. "Thomas Whitmore," she mused, tapping her pen against her teeth. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. My mother used to talk about him, said he was the best carpenter in the county, could fix anything, build anything. But after his fiancée died, he became something of a hermit." "What happened to him?" Sarah asked. "How did the cabin end up abandoned with no heirs?" The clerk's expression grew sad. "That's the tragedy of it. Thomas died in 1984, heart attack, alone in that cabin. By the time anyone found him, it had been almost a week. He had no family to speak of, no will on file. The cabin and the 5 acres it sat on eventually went to the county for unpaid taxes, which is how you were able to purchase it." "But what about the rest of the land?" Sarah pulled out the deed she'd found. According to this, he owned 55 acres total. The clerk's eyes widened as she examined the document. "Well, I need to check our records, but if this is legitimate, and it looks legitimate, then that land should have been part of the tax sale. The fact that it wasn't means someone made a clerical error, or the deed was never properly recorded, or—" She trailed off, her expression troubled. "This could be complicated." "But would I have any claim to it?" Sarah pressed. "I mean, I bought the property. Does that transfer the rights to the additional land?" "That depends on a lot of factors. Let me do some research and talk to the county attorney. Can you come back tomorrow?" Sarah agreed, feeling both hopeful and anxious. She spent the rest of the day in the library, researching property law and mining rights, trying to understand what they might be dealing with. Meanwhile, Emma had her own mission. After school, she approached Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian who'd been helping her find books since she'd started at Willow Creek Middle School. "Mrs. Henderson, did you know Thomas Whitmore, the man who built the cabin where my mom and I live?" The old woman's face lit up. "Know him? Goodness, child, everyone knew Thomas, though not many people knew him well, if you understand the distinction. He kept to himself, especially after Margaret died." "Margaret was his fiancée, right?" Mrs. Henderson nodded, settling into what was clearly going to be a longer story. "Margaret Sinclair, prettiest girl in 3 counties. She and Thomas met at a dance right after he came back from the war. It was love at first sight, the kind you read about in books. He spent 2 years building that cabin for her, every spare moment he had. It was going to be their paradise." "But she died before they could get married." Emma said softly. Yes, tuberculosis, terrible disease. She was sick for weeks before anyone realized how serious it was. By the time they got her to a hospital, it was too late. Mrs. Henderson paused, her eyes distant with memory. But here's the thing people don't talk about much. Margaret's parents were wealthy, owned a lot of land around here. When she died, they blamed Thomas somehow, said he'd kept her out in the cold working on the cabin when she should have been resting. They fought to keep him from attending the funeral. It was ugly. Emma felt a chill. That's awful. It gets stranger, Mrs. Henderson continued. After Margaret died, her parents offered to buy Thomas's land, offered him quite a bit of money for it, actually. They wanted to erase every reminder of his connection to their daughter. Thomas refused, said the land and the cabin were the last pieces of Margaret he had, and he'd die before he'd give them up. Did he stay in contact with them at all? No, they moved away about 5 years after Margaret died. But before they left, Mrs. Sinclair came to see Thomas one last time. No one knows what they talked about, but people said Thomas seemed different after that visit. Not happier exactly, but maybe more at peace. Emma's mind was racing. Mrs. Henderson, what happened to the Sinclairs? Are they still alive? Do they have any other family? William Sinclair died in 1995, and Helen followed in 2000. They never had any other children. Why do you ask? But Emma was already forming a theory, one that seemed both incredible and somehow inevitable. I need to go. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you so much. She rushed home, bursting through the door to find Sarah at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and making notes. Mom, I think I know what happened. I think I know the real treasure. Sarah looked up, startled by her daughter's intensity. Slow down, Em. What are you talking about? Emma pulled out her phone, where she'd been researching during the bus ride home. Okay, so I talked to the librarian, and she told me about Margaret's parents. They were wealthy, and they tried to buy the land from Thomas after Margaret died, but he wouldn't sell. Right, we knew he was attached to the place. But what if it wasn't just sentiment? Emma's eyes were shining. What if Margaret's mother told him something during that last visit? What if she explained why they really wanted the land? Sarah frowned. I'm not following. The copper deposits. The mining company approached Thomas in 1978, right? But the Sinclairs tried to buy the land in the early 1950s, way before anyone was officially exploring mineral rights in this area. How would they have known the land was valuable unless they already knew what was underneath it? Sarah finished, understanding dawning. Margaret must have told Thomas about it. Or maybe she didn't know, Emma suggested. Maybe her parents found out later, and that's why they tried to buy it back. But by then, Thomas understood what he had. That's why he turned down the mining company, not just to protect the land, but because Margaret's parents had tried to take advantage of him when he was grieving. Sarah pulled out the letters from the wooden box, reading them with new eyes. There, in a letter dated 1953, she found the confirmation. Margaret's mother came today. She wept, and I think her tears were genuine, even if her motives were mixed. She told me that William had known about the mineral deposits before Margaret and I ever met, that they'd planned to mine the land until Margaret fell in love with this place, with the idea of living here with me. Mrs. Sinclair said Margaret made her promise to never mine the land while she was alive, that it was going to be our sanctuary. But now that Margaret is gone, William wants to proceed. Mrs. Sinclair asked me to sell, said the money could help me start over somewhere else, away from the memories. I told her no. If Margaret wanted this land protected, then protected it will remain. It's the last wish of hers I can honor. The minerals can stay in the ground. Let them be Margaret's monument. So he knew, Sarah said softly. He always knew the land was valuable, and he chose to protect it anyway. But there's more, Emma said excitedly. She pulled up a web page on her phone. I searched for Margaret Sinclair, and look what I found. She was an artist, Mom, a really good one, and she didn't just sketch, she painted. There's a small gallery in Portland that has 3 of her paintings. They're worth thousands of dollars each now. Sarah's mind was spinning. Are you saying? I'm saying we should check the cabin more carefully. If Thomas kept all those mementos of her, if he lived surrounded by her memory, wouldn't he have kept her artwork too? They spent the next 3 hours searching every corner of the cabin, looking with new purpose. It was Sarah who finally found it, in the back of her bedroom closet, wrapped in canvas and stored flat. A portfolio containing 12 paintings, each one signed Monsieur St. Clair, in the bottom right corner. The paintings were breathtaking. Landscapes of the forest in different seasons, wildlife rendered with stunning detail, and one particularly beautiful piece showing the cabin itself at sunset, smoke curling from the chimney, light glowing warm in the windows, the home as Margaret had imagined it would be. "Mom," Emma whispered, "these could be worth a fortune." Sarah carefully laid the paintings out on the bed, each one a window into Margaret's soul, her vision, her love for this place. I think we need to slow down and think about this carefully. We have 3 potential treasures here. The land with mineral rights, these paintings, and Thomas's story itself. But what's the right thing to do with them? What do you mean? I mean, yes, we need money. Yes, selling the mineral rights or the paintings could solve all our financial problems, but Thomas protected this land for over 30 years because it's what Margaret wanted. And these paintings, they're not just valuable art, they're pieces of her dreams. Is it right for us to profit from them? Emma was quiet for a long moment, looking at the painting of the cabin. Finally, she said, "What if we don't have to choose? What if there's a way to honor their story and still secure our future?" The next day, Sarah returned to the courthouse to find the clerk had news. "The county attorney has reviewed the deed you found. Technically, you have a legitimate claim to the full 55 acres. The land was never separately sold because the deed was never properly recorded in the county system. When you purchased the cabin and its immediate acreage, you legally acquired all property that Thomas Whitmore owned at the time of his death." Sarah felt her knees go weak. "So we actually own it? All of it?" "Yes, we'll need to do some paperwork to correct the records, but yes, the land is yours, mineral rights included." That evening, Sarah made a call to Cascade Mining Corporation. The man who answered was surprised to hear from her. Surprised that anyone owned the Whitmore property, surprised that she knew about the mineral deposits, and very interested in discussing terms. "The copper deposits on that land are substantial," he explained. "We've done updated surveys over the years. At current market prices, we'd be looking at an initial payment of around $200,000 for the mineral rights, plus ongoing royalties as the copper is extracted. Over the life of the mine, you could see well over $1 million. Sarah thanked him and said she'd be in touch. Then she made another call, this one to the gallery in Portland that held Margaret's paintings. The gallery director was effusive. "Margaret Sinclair is one of the great undiscovered artists of her generation. We've been looking for more of her work for years. If you have 12 previously unknown pieces, authenticated pieces, we'd be very interested in representing them. Each painting could sell for anywhere from $15,000 to $50,000, depending on the subject matter and condition." Sarah hung up and looked at Emma, who'd been listening intently to both conversations. "So, what do we do?" Emma had been doing her own research. "I have an idea, but I need you to trust me on something kind of crazy." "Crazier than buying a ruined cabin in the middle of nowhere?" "Maybe a little," Emma admitted with a grin. Then she explained her plan. 2 weeks later, Sarah and Emma stood in the Willow Creek Town Hall, facing a room full of curious residents. The mayor, a practical man named George Brennan, who ran the hardware store, had agreed to host the meeting after Sarah had requested time to address the community. Sarah stood at the podium, Emma beside her, the wooden box and one of Margaret's paintings displayed on a table nearby. "Most of you don't know me yet," Sarah began, her voice surprisingly steady. "My daughter Emma and I moved here a few months ago. We bought the old Whitmore cabin, and in the process of fixing it up, we discovered something remarkable." She told them the story, all of it. Thomas and Margaret's tragic love, the hidden box, the journals and letters, the land with its mineral wealth, and the paintings. As she spoke, she watched the faces in the audience, seeing recognition, sadness, and wonder ripple through the crowd. "Here's the thing," Sarah continued. "Emma and we came here with nothing. We were starting over after our own losses. This land, these paintings, they could change our lives completely. We could sell it all and never worry about money again." She paused, looking at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. "But Thomas Whitmore spent 30 years protecting this land because someone he loved wanted it preserved. And Margaret Sinclair created art that celebrated the beauty of this place. So Emma and I have a proposal." She outlined their plan. They would donate 30 acres of the land, the portion with the most significant forest and wildlife habitat, to the county as a nature preserve, to be named the Margaret Sinclair Memorial Forest. The remaining 25 acres, including the cabin and workshop, they would keep. They would sell 10 of the paintings through the Portland Gallery, but the remaining 2, including the one of the cabin, would be donated to the Willow Creek Historical Society to be displayed permanently, along with Thomas's journals and letters, so that their story would never be forgotten. "As for the mineral rights," Sarah said, "we've learned that the copper deposits are primarily on the eastern boundary of the property. That section is outside the forest preserve. We'll lease those rights to Cascade Mining Corporation, with one condition. 20% of all royalties will go into a trust fund to maintain the nature preserve and support local education initiatives." The room was silent. Then Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the entire hall was applauding. After the meeting, people came up to shake their hands, to share their own memories of Thomas, to welcome Sarah and Emma properly to the community. An elderly man named Harold Gaines approached with tears in his eyes. "I was Thomas's friend," he said quietly. "One of the few he let get close after Margaret died. He would have loved this. He would have loved that you found a way to honor both her dreams and his sacrifice." "Did he ever talk about her?" Emma asked gently. Harold smiled. "All the time, in his way. He said once that love doesn't die just because a person does. He said every board he cut, every project he finished, he did it the way Margaret would have wanted, with care and integrity. He said that was how he kept her alive." That night back at the cabin, their cabin now, truly theirs in a way it hadn't been before, Sarah and Emma sat on the porch with mugs of hot chocolate, watching the stars emerge. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Emma asked. Sarah considered the question. They'd given up potentially millions of dollars in order to honor the wishes of people they'd never met, but they'd also secured enough money to renovate the cabin properly, to pay for Emma's education, to build a real life here, and more importantly, they'd honored a love story that deserved to be remembered. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that we did what Thomas and Margaret would have wanted, and I think we did what we needed to do to make this place really ours, not just legally, but spiritually. Does that make sense?" "Yeah," Emma said softly. "It does." They sat in comfortable silence until Emma spoke again. "Mom, Mrs. Henderson told me something else today. She said Thomas used to tell people that the cabin was waiting for the right family, that it would know them when they came. That's a nice sentiment. But don't you think it's kind of true? I mean, we found the workshop at exactly the right time. I knocked over that box in exactly the right spot to find the floorboard. Every step of the way, it's like the cabin was revealing its secrets to us, bit by bit, leading us to this exact moment." Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Maybe, Or maybe Thomas built this place so well, with so much love, that it naturally takes care of the people who live in it. Either way, I'm grateful we found it. I'm grateful we found each other a new start. Me too, Emma whispered. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, the Margaret Sinclair Memorial Forest was officially dedicated. Sarah and Emma stood with county officials, representatives from the mining company, and what seemed like the entire population of Willow Creek as the mayor unveiled a plaque at the entrance to the preserve. The plaque bore Margaret's painting of the cabin and these words: Margaret Sinclair, 1928-1952, and Thomas Whitmore, 1924-1984. She dreamed of beauty. He built with love. This forest stands as testament to both. Love doesn't die. It transforms into something that endures. After the ceremony, as people explored the trails that wound through the preserve, Emma and Sarah walked back to the cabin. The workshop was now fully restored, and Sarah had started her own small woodworking business, using Thomas's tools to create custom furniture. Emma had begun writing stories inspired by Thomas and Margaret, by the cabin, by the sense that every place holds secrets waiting for the right people to discover them. The cabin itself had been transformed. The roof was sound, the porch was solid, the windows gleamed. But Sarah and Emma had been careful to preserve its character, to honor the bones of what Thomas had built. In the living room, they'd hung one of Margaret's smaller paintings, a gift from the gallery after they'd learned the full story, showing the forest in spring, alive with wildflowers and new growth. That evening, Sarah found Emma in the workshop, carefully oiling the hand tools, as Thomas must have done countless times before. "There's one thing I never figured out," Emma said thoughtfully. "Why did Thomas hide that box under the floorboard? Why not just leave everything in the workshop or in a closet?" Sarah had wondered the same thing. The answer had come from Harold Gaines, Thomas's old friend, who told her a story she hadn't yet shared with Emma. Harold said that about a year before Thomas died, he told him he'd been having dreams of Margaret. In the dreams, she kept showing him a young woman with a daughter, showing them the cabin, telling him they were coming. He said Margaret told him to make sure they found everything they needed. Emma's eyes widened. He hid the box because he knew we'd find it. He knew we'd need to discover it ourselves, to feel like we'd uncovered the mystery. "Maybe," Sarah said. "Or maybe it's just a coincidence, and Harold was an old man sharing an old story. But either way, the result is the same. We found what we needed exactly when we needed it." Emma ran her hand over the smooth wood of the workbench, feeling the connection to the man who'd stood in this same spot, working with these same tools, carrying his grief and his love forward through the work of his hands. "I'm going to write their story," she announced. "The whole thing, everything we learned. Not just about Thomas and Margaret, but about us too. About finding home in unexpected places. About treasures that aren't always about money. About how the past and present can heal each other." "I think that's perfect," Sarah said. "I think they'd both like that very much." As night fell and they walked back to the house, both of them turned to look at the forest preserve, dark and mysterious under the rising moon. Somewhere in those trees, copper rested in the earth, waiting to be extracted, to fund education and preservation and the continuation of Margaret's vision. Somewhere in Portland, people would soon stand before Margaret's paintings and wonder about the woman who'd created such beauty. And here, in this cabin built by love and restored by need, 2 lives were being rebuilt on the foundation of a story that had waited decades to be told. The next morning, Sarah woke early and found Emma already up, sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas's journal open before her and her laptop beside her, her fingers flying over the keys. Sarah made coffee and sat down across from her daughter, watching the words flow. Emma looked up and smiled. "Want to hear what I've written so far?" "Always," Sarah said, and Emma began to read. A single mom bought a ruined cabin. Her daughter discovered a hidden treasure of forgotten secrets. But the real treasure wasn't what they found, it was what they became in the finding. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. That's beautiful, Em. That's exactly right. Because that was the truth of it, the real treasure that no deed or painting or mineral right could capture. They'd come to this place broken and searching, and through the act of uncovering someone else's story, they discovered their own. They'd learned that treasures come in many forms, a workshop full of tools left by caring hands, a box of memories waiting to be found, a forest waiting to be protected, and most importantly, the courage to honor not just the past but the future they were building together. The cabin creaked gently around them, settling into the warmth of the morning sun. And if houses could be content, this one surely was. After decades of silence and abandonment, it was finally what Thomas had built it to be. A home filled with voices and laughter, with dreams being dreamed and lives being lived, with the sound of work being done with care and love. In the workshop, the tools hung in their places, ready to create. In the forest, the trees stood tall and protected. In Portland, Margaret's paintings would soon teach new generations about the beauty of the natural world. And in the cabin built by love and restored by determination, a mother and daughter sat together, writing the next chapter of a story that proved some treasures are worth more than gold, and some secrets are meant to be found by exactly the right people at exactly the right time. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the forest in white, covering the land that Margaret had loved and Thomas had protected, the land that now served as a bridge between past and present, between loss and recovery, between what was lost and what was found, and in that moment everything was exactly as it should be.